A doorman was fired for taking someone else's gift, but the lady saw his pendant, the same one her missing son used to wear. John was a man who had grown accustomed to shadows. His life as a doorman at the Arismendi mansion took place in the dim corners of a place where lights only shone for those who deemed themselves important, while he slipped away into the building's edges. Each morning, at sunrise, he woke up in his tiny house on the outskirts of the city, a grey, unassuming place that barely afforded him the means to live with dignity. The constant roar of traffic leaked through the broken windows, but he no longer heard it. He had learned to ignore even the noises made by the old pipes, which dripped every now and then like a meticulous, silent torture. At the mansion, his workday began the moment the first ray of sun lit the great marble foyer. He spent hours cleaning, opening doors, making sure the entrance was always impeccable for the few who crossed its threshold. His salary barely covered his basic needs, yet it was enough to keep him afloat. The luxuries enjoyed by the residents of the Arismendi mansion, an old aristocratic clan, were not unknown to him, but he kept his distance. He was never interested in what went on behind the mansion's gilded walls. He simply did his job, trying not to bother anyone, not to draw attention. Mrs. Rose, the lady of the mansion, was a woman of elegant yet melancholic bearing, who often seemed lost in her own emptiness. At 60, the wrinkles on her face reflected a life marked by a tragedy she had never been able to overcome. Her only son, Samuel, had disappeared at the age of 10, 15 years ago, in mysterious circumstances that still haunted her. From that moment on, she sank into a routine of suffering, silently waiting for her son's return. She had tried several times to confront her loss, but something inside her prevented her from letting go. Every corner of the mansion was filled with memories of Samuel. His untouched room, the photos still decorating the walls, his gold pendant on the desk, a symbol she never stopped caressing, as though touching it could bring back a part of her missing child. The day everything changed, a package arrived at the Arismendi mansion. It was a large envelope made of a luxurious material, exquisitely designed. Albert, the mansion's manager, a man with a calculating gaze and a deep voice, was in charge of receiving it. It wasn't unusual for the family to receive lavish gifts, but this one seemed different. The label indicated it was destined for Mrs. Rose specifically. The way Albert eyed it gave an air of suspicion, as if something was amiss. At first, he left it on a table in the foyer, ignoring the curiosity it sparked. But in the end, he decided it would be best to deliver it to the lady in person. However, what nobody expected was what happened next. The package, carefully wrapped in shiny paper, disappeared from sight for a moment and later turned up somewhere unexpected. While cleaning the halls, John found the gift in his tiny room. He had no idea how it got there. He thought maybe someone had mistakenly left it, but seeing the package in his space seemed far too suspicious. A strange feeling of anxiety washed over him, as if something was spinning out of control. Soon after, Albert appeared, furious. Fixing his gaze on John, he accused him without hesitation. "Thief! How dare you steal such a valuable gift? This is unacceptable." John couldn't make sense of it, his heart racing as he tried to explain himself, but no words would come. Somehow the accusation weighed on him like a crushing burden. How could he be singled out for something he hadn't done? Before he could defend himself, Mrs. Rose entered the room, drawn by the commotion. Her expression, at first confused, turned cold when her eyes fell on the package and then on John. "What is the meaning of this, John? Why is this gift among your things?" she asked, her voice tense. John tried to explain that he hadn't touched the package, that someone else must have placed it there by mistake, but his words failed to convince anyone. Without showing a hint of doubt, the lady decided to dismiss him on the spot. "I will not tolerate theft under my roof. You have betrayed my trust, John," she said, pointing to the door. Yet before John could leave, Mrs. Rose noticed something on him that chilled her to the bone. A golden pendant, almost identical to the one her son had worn throughout his childhood, sparkled on John's neck. Her breath caught for a moment. The similarity between the two pendants was no coincidence. That much was certain. "That pendant," the lady murmured, unable to say more. The scene froze in place, marked by a suspicion that, though vague, seemed to spring from the deepest part of her being. John left without another word, but the echo of Mrs. Rose's stare would remain with him forever. The Arizmendi mansion, with its air of luxury and mystery, suddenly felt like a place far too strange and dangerous for him. John reached his small home that afternoon with his head full of confused thoughts and a growing anguish in his chest. He had been fired without evidence, without a chance to defend himself. He still didn't understand how the package had ended up in his possession, nor how Albert had been so quick to accuse him. One question kept running in circles in his mind. Why was he the one blamed? The Arizmendi mansion, with its gilded walls and aura of opulence, suddenly seemed distant and hostile, no longer a place for him. As he arrived, Mariana, his roommate, greeted him with a worried look. She was a young woman, strong-willed yet kind. When she saw John, her face grew serious, for something in his posture suggested something terrible had happened. "What's going on, John?" she asked gently, helping him remove his coat. Though her tone was warm, the concern in her eyes was clear. John dropped into a chair and didn't reply for a long moment. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts. Finally, his words came out broken, as though he was still trying to process what had happened. "They accused me of stealing a package. I don't know what to do. I have no idea how it got there, and they just fired me." Mariana sighed and drew closer, resting a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You know you did nothing wrong, John. You just have to find a way to prove it." Though her support was unwavering, her words of encouragement did little to ease the crushing sense of injustice he felt. "What you need to do is calm down and think clearly. They can't just destroy your life without cause." Meanwhile, several miles away at the Arizmendi mansion, Mrs. Rose sat alone in her study, the package still on her desk. The decision she had made hours earlier echoed in her mind, and yet something about it deeply unsettled her. In her thoughts, the golden pendant John wore shone like a beacon, bringing with it a strange and familiar feeling. That same pendant, with its unique design, was the one her son Samuel had worn all through his childhood. Her heart raced as she remembered the days when Samuel was just a boy, when she watched him so full of life, so full of dreams. She recalled how he would often spend hours playing with that pendant, as though it gave him some special power. The lady felt a lump in her throat as she remembered the desperate feeling of never seeing her son again, the same child who had vanished one fateful day 15 years before. Wearing a distant expression, Mrs. Rose began to leaf through an old photo album, the images of her son smiling from happier days. Page after page showed Samuel with the same pendant which had once belonged to her, a family heirloom. In all the photographs, little Samuel wore that same necklace, which, somehow, seemed to bind his life to his mother's in an almost mystical way. "Could it be possible?" she murmured, voice trembling with doubt. Had she made a mistake by firing John without hearing his side? What if that pendant was more than just a coincidence? The lady felt lost in her thoughts, not sure whether she was feeling the call of hope or the pain of a false illusion. She decided she needed answers, and the vague concerns stirring in her heart turned suddenly into an urgent necessity. At the same time, in another part of the mansion, Albert and Richard, Mrs. Rose's brother, were talking behind closed doors. Their faces showed a shared unease they couldn't hide. The way Mrs. Rose had acted concerning the package and her reaction to John's accusation did not sit well with them. Both men knew there was more at stake, something they couldn't allow to come to light. "Rose is starting to have doubts," Albert said, looking out the window. "And I don't like it. You know perfectly well what it means if anyone starts digging into the past. What could be uncovered wouldn't be good for us." Richard nodded, his face partly in shadow. "I know. We can't let this move forward. If she decides to investigate that man, it'll be the end for us. We cannot allow that investigation to gain any traction." They fell into a tense silence. Richard was ready to do whatever was necessary to maintain control of the family, even if it meant manipulating his sister. And Albert, who had always been ready to do whatever it took to please him, didn't hesitate to follow his instinct to bury any clue that might undermine their plans. While the two conspirators exchanged calculated words, Mrs. Rose, her heart still pounding, reached a conclusion. She couldn't remain in doubt any longer. Something inside her insisted that she had to uncover the truth, even if that truth might destroy everything she had known until then. That was when she decided to take a radical step, contacting Julianne Johnson, the detective who, years earlier, had investigated her son's disappearance. Johnson's name evoked old memories, and his involvement might be her only chance to uncover the truth. Mrs. Rose knew that if there was any possibility of finding an answer, it would be through him. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and dialed Johnson's number, determined that the mystery that had surrounded her life for so many years would finally come to an end. The silence in the mansion was broken by the phone call. The shadow of truth was beginning to draw near. Mrs. Rose's study was enveloped in tense silence. Several days had passed since she had decided to contact Detective Julianne Johnson, but at last, the meeting had been confirmed. The lady waited anxiously for the detective's arrival, a man who had led the investigation into her son's disappearance years ago. Although the case had never been solved, she believed Johnson was the only one who could shed any light on the connection between John and Samuel, her missing son. The echo of Johnson's footsteps reverberated in the foyer of the Arismendi mansion, slicing through the air heavy with uncertainty. Mrs. Rose awaited him, seated in a red velvet chair, her expression grave. Over the years, she had never ceased wondering what had happened to Samuel, but now her doubt felt more piercing than ever. "Thank you for coming, Detective," she said, rising to greet him. "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Arismendi," Johnson replied, inclining his head slightly. It was clear from his demeanor that something beyond mere professionalism weighed on him. There was a subtle discomfort, as though he too were being pulled into a deeper undercurrent in this case. "You told me on the phone you needed to investigate one of your employees." Mrs. Rose nodded, her gaze fixed on the detective. "It's not just that, Detective. I need to know the truth about what happened to my son, and I also want to clear up the accusation made against John. I believe it's all connected, though I don't know how." Johnson studied her for a moment before speaking. "Understood. Let's start from the beginning. What can you tell me about John? What do you know about him?" She paused, reflecting on the few times she had spoken to the doorman. "He's a humble man. He's worked here at the mansion for several years. I always thought of him as respectful, quiet. I never imagined he could be involved in something as murky as theft." Her voice wavered at the word theft, as if merely saying it out loud pained her more than she expected. "But that's not what worries me the most, Detective. What truly torments me is the pendant John was wearing." Johnson leaned back in his chair, watching Mrs. Rose closely. "What's special about that pendant?" "It's identical to the one my son wore before he disappeared. The same design, the same material. It can't just be a coincidence," she explained, torn between disbelief and a glimmer of hope. The detective nodded slowly. "That changes things. Let me investigate further. I'll need to look at the records from your son's disappearance. Maybe we can find some link." He headed to the old office where Samuel's case documents were stored. As he leafed through yellowed, time-worn files, something began to catch his eye. Missing pages, incomplete notes, dates that didn't match up. Frowning, he realized something was off. "This makes no sense. How could a child vanish and there be no detailed record of his whereabouts?" He double-checked the dates in the reports, and his suspicions intensified. There were glaring gaps in the documentation. Certain parts of the file were simply gone. The investigation, like other unsolved cases, appeared to have been disorganized. or even tampered with. "What's being hidden here?" he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, a restless Mrs. Rose called for Carmen, the mansion's housekeeper, asking her to join her in private. Carmen had been working there since Samuel disappeared, and her loyalty to the Arismendi family had never wavered. Still, the lady sensed Carmen had left something unsaid. "What do you know about that day, Carmen?" Mrs. Rose asked, her voice shaking. "Is there anything that hasn't been revealed about Samuel's disappearance?" Carmen, who had been like a mother to Samuel, paused for a moment before responding. "Ma'am, I've never spoken about this before, but something odd happened that day. When Samuel went missing, I saw someone near the mansion. I don't know who it was, but I was sure it wasn't a family member. No one mentioned it afterward, and I kept quiet because, well, I thought I might be wrong." She stopped, as if afraid her words might open a door best kept closed. Mrs. Arismendi, alarmed by what she was hearing, leaned closer. "Are you certain, Carmen? I need to know everything you remember. Even the smallest detail could be the key." "I know, ma'am. It's just that nobody believed me back then," Carmen replied with a sigh. "They never really looked into the employees. There were a couple of suspicious people, but nothing came of it." As Mrs. Rose tried to make sense of Carmen's words, Detective Johnson walked into the study, looking grim. He carried a folder full of documents. "I think I've found something important," he said. "The date John arrived at the orphanage overlaps with the period in which your son disappeared. In fact, the records concerning his arrival seem to have been altered." The revelation hit Mrs. Arismendi like a bucket of cold water. The mystery surrounding John was beginning to take shape, yet new questions arose. Could John, the man who had served as a doorman for years, actually be her missing son? Uncertainty filled the room as Mrs. Rose stared at the file, hope and doubt clashing inside her like a storm. Mrs. Rose woke that morning with her emotions in turmoil. Days had passed since Detective Johnson had shown her the first clues that might link John to her son's disappearance. Even so, she didn't want to jump to hasty conclusions. Feeling guilty for having fired the young man without concrete evidence, she decided the time had come to hear him out. She chose a neutral spot, far from the mansion, so they could talk without attracting the staff's attention or fueling rumors. After several phone calls, she convinced John to meet her at a discreet cafe downtown. John agreed more out of curiosity than any desire to reconcile. The sting of the accusation was still fresh. Even so, he arrived right on time, dressed simply and looking tense, like someone who wasn't at all comfortable. Mrs. Rose was waiting at a secluded table, her nerves barely concealed by a tentative smile. On seeing him, she gestured for him to sit, trying to appear warm and approachable. "Thank you for coming, John," she began softly. "I know you've been through a difficult time, and I want to apologize for how I acted." John sat across from her, not quite meeting her eyes. For a few moments, he stayed silent. There was a lump in his throat that made it hard to speak. Finally, he broke the silence, his tone somewhat harsh. "There's no need to apologize, ma'am. After all, you've already fired me. I've lost my job and my reputation. A coffee won't fix that." Although Mrs. Rose could hear the resentment in every word, she refused to be discouraged. Resolute, she pulled a small notebook from her handbag and placed it on the table. She had jotted down a handful of questions she wanted to ask John in an effort to understand him better, though she kept her growing suspicions to herself. "I understand. Still, I wanted to talk to you. There's something that intrigues me." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "That pendant you wear, could you tell me where you got it?" Instinctively, John brought his hand to his chest, where the small golden trinket usually hung. His expression hardened, recalling the countless times that pendant had been his only treasure during childhood. "I can't say exactly," he admitted, lowering his gaze. "I've always had it. When I was a child and ended up at the orphanage, it was the only thing I owned. The caregivers told me it might have come from my birth family, but I never knew more than that." Mrs. Arismendi felt a tremor in her hands at his reply. Her fears and hopes tangled together, searching for any rational explanation. She decided to press further, still holding back her true suspicions. "And you never tried to look for your parents, or find out where you come from?" she asked, with more than mere curiosity in her voice. John let out a tired sigh. "Look for what?" he replied bitterly. "I spent my whole childhood waiting for them to show up, or for someone to adopt me. But none of that ever happened. In the end, I stopped asking questions. Having a roof over my head and a bit of food was enough." Mrs. Rose detected the suppressed anger and helplessness in his trembling voice. She realized that beneath his mask of indifference lay a wounded child who had never gotten any answers. Yet before she could offer him her sympathy, John straightened in his chair slightly, and the uneasy silence between them seemed to gather weight, as if both sensed they were on the brink of a revelation neither could fully grasp. "I don't mean to be rude, Ma'am," he said, trying to keep a calm tone, "but I don't understand what you're after. First you accuse me of theft, fire me, and now you want to know about my life. Why do you care so much?" Mrs. Arismendi drew a deep breath. She couldn't reveal all her suspicions, not yet. Nor did she want to pretend she was only interested in apologizing. So she chose her words carefully. "I feel I was unfair to you, and I want to help clear your name. Deep down, I believe there was a mistake. Besides, that pendant of yours reminds me of someone very dear to me." John, however, was too hurt to accept a gesture of good faith so easily. He recalled the humiliations he'd suffered and the sense of betrayal at being accused without any proof. "I don't need charity, ma'am, nor your pity," he replied, tension clear in his voice. "I just want to leave all of this behind and get on with my life." Their meeting ended with a tense farewell. John left the cafe feeling more confused than before. He wondered why this high society woman suddenly seemed so interested in his story. His instincts told him there was something more behind her questions, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Later, back at the small home he shared with Mariana, he recounted everything that had happened. She listened intently, worried that Mrs. Rose was probing into John's life, especially his past at the orphanage. Yet instead of dismissing it, Mariana saw an opportunity to clear her friend's reputation. "John, maybe this is your chance to prove you had nothing to do with the theft. If you give her a chance, maybe she can help you," Mariana suggested in a conciliatory tone. "Help me? The same woman who accused me of stealing and fired me without proof," John retorted bitterly. "I know it's not easy, but at least hear her out. If she insists on seeing you, maybe she's feeling remorse. Or maybe there's something else she's not telling you." He shook his head, but deep down he recognized that Mariana wasn't entirely wrong. A burning sense of injustice still lingered in his heart, but he had a hunch that if there was any way to prove his innocence, it probably had to do with Mrs. Rose and that stolen package. Meanwhile, at the Arismendi mansion, Albert learned about Mrs. Rose's meeting with John from one of the drivers, who had happened to see her leaving for the cafe. Uneasy, Albert realized that the lady was taking steps to uncover the truth. He feared that if John came back to the mansion, things from the past might surface, things that would be bad news for both him and Richard. Sensing the danger, Albert contacted Richard, who was equally alarmed by his sister's actions. The two conspired to keep John away from the mansion for good. They couldn't allow Johnson's investigation and Mrs. Rose's renewed curiosity to reach conclusions that would harm their interests. That evening, Mrs. Arismendi withdrew to her room with her heart in knots. Her impressions of the encounter with John were still fresh, and more than once she believed she saw in his gaze, in certain gestures, or in the way he rubbed the pendant, a spark that brought to mind her son Samuel. It was almost imperceptible, but she couldn't deny that it reminded her vividly of the child she had lost. Alone in her bedroom, she once again looked through photographs of Samuel. She studied his innocent smile, his curious eyes, and her thoughts flew back to John's face. They weren't identical, but there was something in the expression, in the faint slump of his shoulders that sent a chill down her spine. Memories swirled around her, mingling with hope and guilt. What if, after all, John could be the son she had believed lost forever? With a trembling hand, she closed the photo album, telling herself it might just be another illusion. But the harder she tried to deny it, the stronger the certainty grew that there was something real behind those coincidences. And that certainty, now more intense than ever, would not abandon her. Detective Julianne Johnson rose very early the next morning, ready to embark on a journey into John's past. He had received some preliminary information about the orphanage, where this man, accused of theft and suspected of being Mrs. Arismendi's long-lost son, had spent his childhood. He drove for hours along a dusty highway until he reached the outskirts of the city. There, beyond a rusty metal gate, stood an old, run-down building with a grim, neglected appearance. Upon entering, Johnson was greeted by an uneasy silence. There didn't seem to be much activity, only a few children running through the corridors and a couple of exhausted caregivers who barely took notice of him. A middle-aged social worker met him and led him to a tiny office serving as an archive. Though the room was full of boxes and folders, it was obvious the organization left much to be desired. "I understand a boy named John lived here many years ago," the detective explained, showing the social worker the full name of the person he was investigating. The woman searched an old filing system, flipping through dirty, yellow documents. Her expression changed when she didn't immediately find what she was looking for. "We have some records, but we're missing a lot of files from that era," she admitted, somewhat embarrassed. "The orphanage has changed management multiple times, and frankly, many documents have been lost." The detective, however, was not discouraged. Methodically, he began to review every folder and every piece of paper that might offer a clue. Suddenly, he came upon a dossier that caught his attention. The records had been tampered with. Certain dates were altered, and in several places, pages seemed to have been torn out or names crossed out. Johnson frowned. This was no mere oversight. "Is there anyone still working here who was around back then?" he asked, hoping for a more concrete lead. The social worker left and returned a few minutes later with a slightly hunched man in his 60s who leaned on a cane. His name was Don Eusebio, an old custodian who had been at the orphanage for decades. Upon seeing the detective, he greeted him politely and sank into a chair with a heavy sigh. "I remember a boy who came in with a very peculiar pendant," the old man began. "He clung to it like it was a treasure. The poor kid didn't talk much. He seemed scared." Johnson felt a spark of excitement. Adjusting his glasses, he leaned forward. "Do you remember anything else about him? Perhaps his name?" He pressed carefully. Don Eusebio nodded slowly. "Yes, the boy was called John. He was one of the few who arrived without proper papers. He was around 5 or 6 years old, but nobody was sure. That pendant of his, I believe it had some small symbol or initials etched on it, but I can't recall exactly." Johnson's heart pounded faster. The account confirmed that John had indeed lived there and underscored the existence of a pendant so similar to Samuel's, the son Mrs. Arismendi had lost. The detective excused himself to continue searching through the dusty archives. Eventually, he found a faded document suggesting that John's birth date coincided with Samuel's. It was a crucial piece of evidence, though not yet conclusive. Without delay, Johnson began the procedures to request a DNA test, a process requiring cooperation from the authorities and the willingness of any potential family members. Yet he held this information back, aware that generating too much hope prematurely could cause needless turmoil. He preferred solid proof before giving Mrs. Arismendi any glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at the Arismendi mansion had grown tense. Carmen, the housekeeper, noticed that Albert, the manager, was acting suspiciously. More than once, she spotted him hovering near doors when Mrs. Rose was on the phone, or lurking in the library when the lady and the detective were conferring. His behavior didn't add up. He seemed to be eavesdropping on any conversation that might implicate him. Discreetly, Carmen began tracking Albert's movements. She observed how he rummaged through papers that weren't his to handle and even paid excessive attention to the lady's notebooks. That was when she recalled the old rumors suggesting that certain details of Samuel's disappearance had never been fully investigated. Loyal to Mrs. Arismendi, Carmen felt a shiver of suspicion. Could Albert have played a shady role in all this? Or was he following someone else's orders? The answer began to unfold a few hours later. Richard, Mrs. Arismendi's brother, arrived unannounced, claiming he wanted to look after his sister during this tumultuous time. He came across as protective, speaking kind words, and insisting his only concern was the family's peace. Yet in private, he sought out Albert in one of the most secluded rooms of the mansion. "We have a problem," Richard said in a low voice, looking at Albert intently. "This investigation can't go anywhere. Do you understand me? We need to deal with John." Albert, fully aware of the power Richard wielded in the family, nodded. "Sir, I'm doing everything I can, but the lady is very interested in that young man, and the detective has more leads than we expected." Richard clicked his tongue impatiently. "Then get rid of the problem as soon as possible. You know what's at stake. If Rose's doubts are confirmed, all our efforts to keep the past hidden will collapse." The two men parted with a mutual understanding. John must not return to the mansion or grow closer to Mrs. Arismendi. The risk that the truth behind Samuel's disappearance might come to light grew by the day. While Albert and Richard schemed to protect their interests, Johnson finalized the details for sending a DNA sample to a reliable lab. After his findings at the orphanage, the detective felt increasingly certain that John was Mrs. Arismendi's son. Though the paperwork was incomplete and the past remained murky, everything pointed in the same direction. News of these developments reached Albert's ears, and through him, Richard's as well. Both men shuddered upon hearing that their plans to keep the truth hidden were on the verge of collapsing. If the DNA test proved conclusive, everything would come to light. Richard's reputation would be irreparably stained, and Albert would face serious consequences. Panicked, Albert devised a desperate plan. First, he considered approaching Detective Johnson to offer him money in exchange for his silence. He thought that with a substantial sum, the investigator might be tempted to alter the results or delay turning in the information. However, he knew Johnson wasn't easily swayed by bribes. Then, a more sinister idea came to him: sabotaging the laboratory conducting the DNA test. If he managed to destroy or tamper with the samples, he might at least buy some time. Heart pounding, Albert made several late-night calls to dubious contacts. Anything was fair game if it could save him from impending disaster. Meanwhile, Richard anxiously awaited news of these maneuvers. If they failed, he was prepared to take more radical measures to keep his involvement in Samuel's disappearance hidden. Within the mansion, still unaware of Albert's clandestine moves, Mrs. Rose and Carmen prepared themselves for the imminent confirmation of the genetic test. The lady stood firm in her decision to clear John's name and give him the opportunity to reclaim the life that might have been taken from him. Meanwhile, tension mounted in every corridor of the Arismendi mansion. Everyone sensed that, one way or another, the end was drawing near. Dawn broke over the city with a grayish sky, as turbid as the atmosphere surrounding the Arismendi family. Detective Julianne Johnson, after several days of important breakthroughs, strode determinedly down one of the busiest streets. He was pleased with the latest evidence he'd gathered. He had obtained additional copies of key documents, suspecting someone might attempt to sabotage or destroy any proof linking John to the Arismendi family. His instincts proved correct. In the shadows, Albert and Richard were striving to bury the truth. During the early hours of the morning, Albert made one final desperate attempt to stop Johnson. He managed to intercept him near the mansion, where the detective had gone to pick up some samples. Wearing a forced smile, Albert offered him a thick envelope, suggesting it was a bonus for his services. Johnson's astonishment quickly turned to indignation. "Are you trying to bribe me?" he asked, holding back his anger. "Call it what you like. Let's just say there are people very interested in making sure this case doesn't come out, Albert replied, making no effort to conceal his intentions. Without another word, the detective handed the envelope back, unopened. "You're wasting your time," he stated firmly. "As long as I'm alive, I'll do everything in my power to ensure Mrs. Arizmendi learns the truth." He then spun on his heel and walked away, leaving Albert scowling. Albert knew of Johnson's reputation as a man of integrity, but had still hoped for a trace of greed. Frustrated, he realized bribing the detective would be impossible. Adding to his worries, Johnson had been cautious enough to duplicate all the documentation and keep copies in safe places. Meanwhile, Richard was pacing restlessly in his luxurious office, consumed by memories. He had always been bothered by how his sister, Mrs. Rose, focused all her attention on Samuel, the family's heir, who was destined for a prominent position. Richard felt consigned to the background, as if his own existence carried no weight. What began as silent jealousy grew darker over time. 15 years earlier, when Samuel disappeared, Richard secretly pulled a few strings. Though he hadn't been directly responsible for the boy's vanishing, he helped certain people take him far away, leaving almost no trace. His intention had been to force Rose to focus on keeping the family together and relying on him, her brother. He still remembered the mix of relief and guilt he felt upon learning the boy was missing from the mansion. He believed that, without Samuel, he could finally move to the forefront and influence financial decisions, ensuring the inheritance wouldn't be solely in his nephew's hands. But the remorse never faded. It became a thorn lodged deep inside him, torturing him at the most unexpected moments. Now, seeing the detective and Mrs. Rose so close to linking John's story with Samuel's pushed him to desperation. If the whole truth came out, no one would ever forgive him for that awful act. Meanwhile, at the mansion, John was going through sleepless nights. He'd heard that the detective had obtained preliminary results indicating a very high probability that he was Mrs. Rose's biological son. Mariana, with a mix of happiness and caution, gave him the news. Yet John wasn't sure what to feel. Part of him was moved by the idea of having a mother, of not having been alone in the world. Another part bristled with anger and helplessness, remembering all the years he'd spent in an orphanage, believing he'd never been wanted. "So you're saying I always had a family?" he stammered, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "And where were they when I was hungry and freezing?" Seeing him so shaken, Mariana placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Maybe there was some misunderstanding, something that got out of control. I don't know, John. But if it's true, and Mrs. Arizmendi is your mother, you both deserve answers. You deserve a chance to rebuild the bond you were denied." Her words echoed in his mind. Could he let go of the resentment and allow new feelings to grow? Or would the pain he carried inside be stronger? With a tormented heart, John realized that sooner or later, he would have to face his true history. As tension escalated everywhere within the Arizmendi mansion, Carmen and Detective Johnson had managed to corner Albert with the facts. The housekeeper, along with other evidence she had collected, presented irrefutable details about the false theft of the costly gift. Moreover, statements from some of the staff began to highlight inconsistencies pointing directly to Albert as the mastermind behind it all. "What do you have to say to these findings?" Johnson inquired, his voice firm. Trapped, Albert began to sweat. For several seconds, he tried to defend himself with clumsy lies, but on seeing Carmen's photographic copies and testimonies, he crumbled. The trembling of his hands gave him away. "All right," he finally muttered in a shaky voice. "I put the gift among John's things to frame him, but I didn't act alone. I had orders." His confession shattered the late afternoon calm. Feeling a knot in his throat, Albert hinted, without naming too many names, that the goal had been to get John out of the mansion, to make Mrs. Arizmendi stop taking an interest in him. He claimed he'd been pressured, though he didn't dare directly accuse Richard. Even so, his half-spoken words were enough to confirm that John had been made a scapegoat. Right at that moment, Mrs. Rose, who had come to the office driven by curiosity, heard the final sentences of the confession. Her face contorted with outrage as she grasped the extent of the injustice committed against the young man she increasingly suspected was her own son. "You framed him knowing he was innocent?" she burst out, her voice blazing with fury and pain. Her eyes shone with a fire few had ever seen in her. Pale, Albert couldn't meet her gaze. He mumbled some feeble excuses, but the damage was done. Standing in the doorway, Mrs. Rose was overcome by a torrent of emotions: anger, guilt, the longing to embrace John and beg his forgiveness, and a swelling desire for justice that refused to be contained. A heavy silence fell, trembling with the promise of an imminent reckoning. The truth, cruel yet necessary, had found its way out, and no lie could suppress it any longer. The next morning dawned with a pale sky over the Arizmendi mansion, yet inside, the atmosphere was so heavy it could be felt in every corner. Mrs. Rose had summoned all those involved to a formal meeting in the Grand Salon, a space with high ceilings and windows opening onto the gardens. The antique chandeliers seemed to quiver amid the tension of that morning. Richard was there, brow furrowed, hands restless. Albert stood nearby, visibly anxious, under the watchful eyes of a pair of security guards. Not far off were Carmen, Detective Johnson, and, standing slightly apart, John, accompanied by Mariana. The silence stretched on until Mrs. Rose made her entrance, dressed in dark clothing, her expression grave and her steps firm. Despite the strength she had always shown, a faint trembling in her hands betrayed her inner turmoil. Without any preamble, she spoke. "I've gathered you all here because it's time to uncover the truth," she announced, her voice slightly unsteady. "Suspicions, accusations, and lies end today." That declaration marked the beginning of one of the tensest sessions in the recent history of the Arizmendi family. Richard cast a displeased look at Albert, dreading that he might be implicated outright. Albert, for his part, tried to compose himself and feign composure, though his gaze kept darting around as if searching for some escape route. Meanwhile, John stood in silence, feeling his heart pound so hard it rang in his ears. "Detective Johnson," Mrs. Rose went on, "I'm grateful for all the work you've done. You have the floor to present your findings." Carrying a briefcase with several documents, the detective nodded respectfully before taking position in the center of the room. He opened the case with deliberate care, extracted a sealed envelope, and addressed the gathering. "These results come from a reputable laboratory. They are DNA tests comparing Mrs. Arizmendi's genetic material to that of John." His voice echoed in the hall, and the silence grew denser still. "The results are conclusive. According to the test, John is Mrs. Rose's biological son, the boy who disappeared 15 years ago." A murmur ran through those present. Mariana squeezed John's hand, sensing how his breathing quickened. Carmen let out a faint gasp. Richard gritted his teeth, while Albert cast his glance toward the door, painfully aware that there was no going back. "This can't be," exclaimed Richard, feigning surprise. He attempted an incredulous look. "How is that possible? Are you sure there's no error in the tests?" The detective merely lifted his eyebrows. In calm silence, he pulled out more papers from the briefcase. "The analyses were reviewed twice. There's no margin of error. And that's not all," he went on, opening another folder. "We have concrete evidence that the supposed theft pinned on John was a setup orchestrated by Albert, with possible involvement from—" He paused, shooting a serious glance at Richard. "Other individuals." Photographs showing the expensive gift stashed in Albert's room were displayed. Carmen explained what she had witnessed, and the timeline of events ultimately confirmed that everything had been staged to drive John away from the mansion. Mrs. Rose listened in silence, pained by each detail, remembering how many times she had doubted John's innocence. "I didn't do it alone," Albert muttered, feeling cornered. His eyes shifted between the detective and Richard. "I was following orders." "Shut up, liar!" Richard cut him off, trying to maintain composure but letting his fury show. Johnson exchanged a knowing look with Mrs. Rose, then continued, "We also have statements indicating that Richard was involved, 15 years ago, in the child's disappearance. Perhaps he wasn't the direct perpetrator, but he facilitated what happened so that Samuel wouldn't be the family heir or its focus of attention." Mrs. Rose closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the nearly obsessive way her brother had tried to take control of the family after Samuel vanished, and all the times he insisted that the family remain united under his leadership. The confirmation of such betrayal hurt her more than anything else. "Have you anything to say in your defense, Richard?" she asked, raising her voice and opening her eyes with renewed resolve. Richard swallowed hard, realizing there was no way out now. Enraged, he stood and admitted a partial confession, claiming his intentions had never been that serious and that he'd never planned for such a dire outcome. But the cards were already on the table. His role in the conspiracy was laid bare for all to see. Johnson pronounced the final words. "Richard, Albert, we have more than enough proof to charge you with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and, in Richard's case, possible complicity in the disappearance of a minor. The authorities have already been notified." The security guards present stepped forward and discreetly positioned themselves on each side of Albert and Richard. Mrs. Rose's gaze, a mix of disappointment and pain, fixed on the two men. For years, she had considered them trusted members of her innermost circle. Now that trust lay broken in the cruelest way possible. "Those responsible will face justice," the lady said firmly. "I will not tolerate any more lies or manipulation in my house." Richard and Albert were promptly placed in custody. Everyone else witnessed the scene with relief and sorrow. Carmen shed a few tears, saddened to see the Arizmendi family torn apart like this. Yet there was some solace. At last, John was receiving the justice he deserved. After the commotion, the grand salon fell into a hush. Still stunned by the declaration confirming his true identity, John stood unsure whether to leave or approach Mrs. Rose. She walked over, her face showing a swirl of conflicting emotions. Her hands trembled as she reached out. "My son," she whispered, choking back tears. "You don't know how sorry I am for everything you've had to endure." John felt his eyes growing misty. He hesitated, remembering all the hardships of orphanage life, the uncertainty over his origins, and the baseless accusation of theft. Even so, the sight of Mrs. Rose's remorseful, loving gaze stirred a warmth in his chest. At last, he stepped forward and melted into an embrace that was 15 years overdue. Carmen and Mariana watched with tears in their eyes, while Johnson moved back a few steps, fully aware of the intimacy of the moment. The detective had spent years working on challenging cases, but rarely had he witnessed a reunion so charged with emotion. Sincere and profound, their reunion was not free of bitterness. Though it seemed a new stage was beginning, it was also clear that rebuilding this mother-son relationship would not be easy. Open wounds remained, years had been lost, and resentments might take time to heal. Still, at that moment, the two held each other tightly, clinging to the hope that, after so much darkness, the truth had finally come to light. As law enforcement led Richard and Albert away, Mrs. Rose and John remained in the center of the grand salon, enveloped by an odd tranquility. The history of the Arizmendi mansion had changed forever. At long last, the mother had found her son again, and the son, after so many years of doubts, had found the place he rightfully belonged to. Yet that was only the beginning of a long path toward reconciliation, a path they would have to tread with both caution and resolve. The days following that major revelation passed in a swirl of conflicting emotions. The Arizmendi mansion, once a place where silence cloaked secrets and lies, became the epicenter of sweeping changes. The echoes of the authorities' footsteps faded down the corridors, and the old walls seemed to breathe in relief after so many years of concealed tension. On the morning after that decisive meeting, Albert and Richard had to appear before the authorities to answer for their deeds. The charges against them were decisive: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and, in Richard's case, potential involvement in the disappearance of a minor. Although their defense lawyer tried to argue that the accusations were weak, the evidence presented by Detective Johnson, along with testimonies from Carmen and other staff, was overwhelming. The trial would not be long in coming, and justice would subject them to a thorough examination at last. As for Detective Johnson, he was now able to close a case that had remained unsolved for 15 years. In his hands, the file labeled Samuel Arismendi, the child whose whereabouts had never been officially confirmed, became a finished document bearing the most unexpected resolution. Samuel was alive, and the young man known as John was indeed the lost Arismendi heir. With a sense of accomplishment, Johnson sealed the file, well aware that life rarely grants the chance to end a chapter with such a pivotal outcome. While legal matters moved forward, breezes of reconciliation began to blow through the Arismendi mansion. Carmen, now freed from the intrigues that had stifled the family, resumed her duties with renewed serenity. She no longer had to worry about Albert's stealthy footsteps or Richard's silent commands. She continued to serve the family with loyalty, but this time she felt truly free to voice her opinions and look after Mrs. Rose's and John's well-being. During this interim, Mrs. Rose and John tiptoed around each other, so to speak. Despite the formal confirmation that Mrs. Arismendi was his biological mother, it was not easy to erase the pain and resentment built up over 15 long years. Still, the lady was determined to show how deeply she regretted every second of his absence and every injustice he had suffered. Driven by this resolve, one day she took John by the hand and led him along a long corridor until they reached a door at the far end, locked with a key. "It was here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want you to see the place I've kept just as you left it. Or, well, just as it was the day you disappeared." When he opened the door, the young man found a child's bedroom frozen in time. On the desk lay drawing pads, their colors faded only slightly over the years. A few toy cars, old but well-maintained, rested on a shelf. The bed was made with sheets now faded, yet untouched, as though Mrs. Rose had been waiting for her son's return every night for all those years. The sight overwhelmed him with emotion. Vague images pushed their way into his mind, flashes of a forgotten childhood, the warmth of a place he could barely recall. Mrs. Rose stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I never stopped waiting for you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Maybe I didn't do enough. Maybe I made terrible mistakes. But I always kept this room ready in case you ever came back." John, eyes misty with tears, walked around the room, taking in every corner and feeling something spark inside him. It wasn't just a memory, it was tangible proof that there had been a home awaiting him. He turned to Mrs. Rose, and for the first time, he embraced her without hesitation. An embrace that carried sadness, anger, forgiveness, and hope all at once. Their reconciliation didn't remain strictly private. A few days later, Mrs. Rose organized a small public event in the mansion gardens, inviting neighbors, family friends, and people from John's past. The goal was clear: to clear John's name, establish his innocence, and publicly reveal the truth about his identity. That afternoon, sunlight streamed over the green lawns surrounding the mansion. Chairs were arranged around a small stage from which Mrs. Rose spoke. Under the expectant gaze of those who had come, she talked about the misunderstandings, the conspiracies, and above all, the importance of the truth. John stood silently by her side, with Mariana holding his hand gently. "Today, I come to correct a monumental mistake," Mrs. Rose announced. "I have tarnished the name of an innocent young man and denied him his place in this house and in my heart for years. Now I know that John, standing here, is my son Samuel, who disappeared 15 years ago. I wish to publicly ask his forgiveness and declare that from now on, we will do everything in our power to reclaim the lost time." Spontaneous applause broke out among the guests. Many were touched to see how prejudices and secrets were giving way to a family's reconciliation. Some local reporters jotted down notes and snapped photos, eager to share this story that seemed straight out of a novel. John, for his part, spoke a few brief words, expressing relief that the truth had finally come to light. "I won't deny that I've felt a lot of pain, resentment and sadness," he said. "But I've also learned there are people who fight for justice and truth, like Detective Johnson, Carmen, Mariana. And now I understand. My mother too. I hope this marks the beginning of something new." More applause followed, along with expressions of affection. Mariana, her eyes welling with tears, felt a lump in her throat at seeing him so ready to leave the shadows of his past behind. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but at least they were taking their first steps with confidence. After the event, the Arismendi mansion found itself immersed in an atmosphere of calm. Family photos were once again hung on the walls, no longer bearing the weight of an absent ghost. Carmen smiled as she set the dining room table for the private celebration afterward, grateful to see the house alive again. Satisfied with the case finally resolved, Johnson bade everyone farewell, announcing that once the legal procedures were concluded, he would close the case officially and move on to new challenges. When it came time for the formal goodbye, John and Mariana stayed close to Mrs. Rose. Mother and son stood at the mansion's main portico, the very spot where she had waited so many times for a return that at last had come true. With a gesture of affection, Mrs. Rose laid her hand over John's. "We have so much to talk about, so much to forgive, and so much to learn, my son," she said softly. "But I promise that from now on, I will always be there for you." "I promise too," John replied, gazing at his mother with genuine gratitude. As the last rays of sunlight shone across the windows, the final image was that of John and Mrs. Rose walking together into the gardens amid murmurs of hope. The old mansion, once witness to conspiracies and secrets, now stood as a stage for second chances and reconciliation. From the walkways, people departed with the sense that something beautiful had taken place. The truth had finally prevailed, and mother and son were ready to heal the wounds of a past that should never have driven them apart. An imaginary camera rose slowly, showing the silhouettes of both against the trees, while the evening light wrapped the closing scene in warmth, a scene filled with pain, love, and redemption. Thus ended the final chapter, with the promise of a different future for the Arismendi family. Sometimes life's greatest trials come shrouded in pain and injustice. Yet this story reminds us that although the truth may take time to surface, it never truly disappears. Each misstep, every betrayal, and every wound paved the way for light to overcome the shadow of secrets in the end. In John's reunion with his true mother, we see forgiveness and hope come together, demonstrating that it is never too late to start anew and rescue family ties we once believed irreparably lost. Reconciliation, though difficult, is the key that sets the heart free from bitterness and resentment. Mrs. Rose and John show us that when love is fought for sincerely, no gulf is so wide that a bridge can't be built. With time, lies fade away, leaving only what is born of honesty and compassion. Thus, the Arismendi mansion, once the stage for secrecy, now stands as a symbol of renewal, a reminder that even in the darkest corners, truth waits for its moment to shine and heal. Thank you for joining us to the very end. Remember, every story can have a new beginning. This one is no exception. If you enjoyed it, give us a like and subscribe for more content. We'll see you soon with more tales full of emotion and hope.